August 17, 1943. Dobodura Airfield, New Guinea. 7:42 a.m. Technical Sergeant Walt, Brennan crouched beneath the left engine nacelle of a P-38 Lightning, watching his pilot prepare for a mission that would probably kill him. The pilot was Lieutenant Robert Hayes, 23 years old, 6 combat missions, 0 kills, about to fly straight into 18 Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters. Walt was 58 years old. He shouldn't have been here. He should have been home in Detroit, retired from Ford Motor Company after 35 years building engines. Should have been spending his days fishing, working in his garage, maybe teaching his grandson how to rebuild a carburetor. But when the draft boards ran out of young mechanics in 1942, they started taking the old ones. Men with skills the military desperately needed: machinists, welders, aircraft mechanics. Anyone who understood engines and could work with their hands. Walt had built engines his entire adult life. Started as an apprentice at Ford in 1907, worked his way up to master mechanic. By the time he retired in 1941, he built or rebuilt over 3,000 automotive engines. He knew tolerances, understood harmonics, could diagnose problems by sound alone. The Army Air Force saw his work history and immediately assigned him to aircraft maintenance. Sent him to technical school for 3 months to learn the P-38 Lightning, Lockheed's twin-engine, twin-boom fighter that looked like nothing else in the sky. Walt took to it quickly. An engine was an engine. The principles didn't change just because it had wings attached. But for 8 months, he'd been watching pilots die. Good men. Kids, really? They climbed into their P-38s with confidence, and came back in boxes. Or didn't come back at all. The P-38 Lightning was fast, over 400 miles per hour in level flight. It was heavily armed, 4.50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose. It was rugged. Twin engines meant you could lose one and still fly home. But it had one fatal flaw that was killing American pilots every single day. It couldn't turn with a zero. The Japanese A6M Zero was lighter, more agile, could execute a full horizontal turn in half the time a P-38 needed. In a dogfight, that difference meant death. American doctrine said P-38 pilots should never turn with a zero. Never try to outmaneuver them. Use speed. Use altitude. Dive in, shoot, climb out. Hit and run tactics. Don't get caught in a turning fight. Lieutenant Hayes had tried following that doctrine 5 times. It hadn't worked. The Zeros were too smart. They baited American pilots into turns, cut inside their turning radius, got on their tails, shot them down. The 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38s in the past 6 weeks. Most were shot down after being caught in turning engagements. They couldn't escape. Walt had watched too many of them die. The first was Lieutenant David Chin. July 9th. Farm kid from California who talked about opening a garage after the war. Chin took off at 6:15 a.m. on a fighter sweep. Came back 2 hours later with 3 bullet holes in his left boom and a story about a zero that had gotten inside his turn. Chin said his airplane felt slow to respond, like there was a delay between when he moved the stick and when the aircraft actually rolled. The zero almost got him. Only his wingman's intervention saved his life. Chin didn't fly again. His aircraft went to the depot for repairs. 3 weeks later, Walt heard Chin had been killed flying a different P-38 over Rabaul. Same story, caught in a turning fight, couldn't roll out fast enough. The second was Captain William Morrison. August 3rd, experienced flight leader with 11 kills. Morrison intercepted 8 Zeros at 12,000 feet. Got one on the first pass, came around for another run. 2 Zeros reversed on him. Morrison tried to roll inverted and split S away, standard evasive maneuver. Called out over the radio that his controls felt mushy. The Zero stayed with him through the maneuver, shot him down at 4,000 feet. Morrison died in the crash. By mid-August, Walt had watched 17 pilots die. The ones who came back told the same story. The P-38 felt slow to respond in hard maneuvering. like there was a slight lag between control input and aircraft reaction. Most pilots thought that was just how the airplane handled heavy fighter, big control surfaces. Some delay was expected. But Walt knew that wasn't normal. He'd felt that delay with his own hands when he worked on the control cables. That tiny bit of slack in the system, maybe 3/8 of an inch of play at full deflection. The P-38's aileron control cables ran through the twin booms to the tail section, then forward through pulleys to the wing control surfaces. The cable system had slack built into it. Factory tolerances allowed for it. At high speeds it didn't matter. But at low speeds during hard-turning maneuvers, that fraction of a second delay was the difference between rolling inside a Zero's turn and getting shot down. Walt had mentioned this to the engineering officer 2 months ago. The officer said cable tension was within specifications. Factory tolerances allowed for that slack. Changing it would void the aircraft warranty. Besides, no field mechanic had authorization to modify flight control systems. That required engineering approval from Lockheed. And Lockheed was 7,000 miles away in California. On the evening of August 16th, Lieutenant Hayes came to the maintenance area. Found Walt working on his assigned P-38. Hayes's hands were shaking. His eyes had the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much death in too short a time. "Sergeant Brennan," Hayes said quietly, "is there anything you can do to make this airplane roll faster?" Walt looked at the young pilot. Saw the fear. Saw the desperation. Saw a kid who knew he was going to die if something didn't change. "Come back in the morning," Walt said. "I'll see what I can do." That night, Walt worked alone. The maintenance hangar was quiet after 11 p.m. Most of the crew had gone to sleep. The only sounds were the distant rumble of generators and the buzz of insects against the overhead lights. Walt pulled the inspection panel off Hayes's P-38 left boom. Inside, the aileron control cable ran through a series of pulleys toward the tail section. He grabbed the cable with both hands and pulled. Felt the slack, maybe 3/8 of an inch of play before the tension caught. His hands were covered in grease. His fingers ached from a full day of maintenance work. But he could feel that slack clearly. It was wrong. He knew it was wrong. From his tool bag, Walt pulled a piece of steel spring wire, salvaged from a damaged P-38's landing gear assembly. He'd kept it without really knowing why. Now he knew. He sat on the hangar floor with the wire and a pair of pliers, bending it carefully into an S shape. The wire was stiff, fought back against his arthritic hands. His fingers slipped twice. The S-shaped wire would act as an inline tensioner, adding just enough preload to the cable to eliminate the slack completely. Installing it was harder. The space inside the boom was tight. Walt had to work with one hand while holding a flashlight with the other. His shoulder wedged against the boom structure. The metal edge cut into his arm. He disconnected the cable at the pulley junction, inserted the spring wire tensioner between the cable end and the pulley, reconnected everything. When it finally seated, he tested the tension by hand. Pulled on the cable. No slack. The control surface moved immediately. Perfect. Walt's heart was pounding. If the engineering officer found him doing unauthorized modifications to a flight control system, he'd face court-martial. Possibly dishonorable discharge. Maybe even prison time. But Hayes was going to die if Walt didn't do something. He replaced the inspection panel, cleaned up his tools, walked out of the hangar at 1:15 a.m. The tropical night was humid and still. Somewhere in the distance, he heard aircraft engines, Japanese night raiders, probably. Walt had just modified a flight control system without authorization. Used a non-standard part. Violated at least a dozen regulations. If the modification failed during flight, Hayes would crash. And Walt would be responsible. But if it worked, Hayes might live. At 6:30 a.m., Walt stood on the flight line watching the crew fuel and arm Hayes's aircraft. Watched Hayes walk out for his pre-flight briefing. Watched him climb into the cockpit. At 7:42 a.m., Hayes took off. Walt stood on the flight line and watched the P-38 climb into the morning sky. Watched it join formation with 16 other aircraft. watched them head northwest toward Japanese airspace. And then all he could do was wait. The engagement started at 8:14 a.m. Hayes's flight of 4 P-38s intercepted 9 Zeros at 13,000 feet over Huon Gulf. Perfect setup for a diving attack, sun behind them, altitude advantage. Hayes picked a Zero at the back of the formation. Dove from altitude, built speed to 380 miles per hour. The Zero grew larger in his gun sight. He pressed the trigger. Tracers reached out. A few hits sparked off the Zero's wing. Not enough. The Zero snap-rolled right and dove. Hayes rolled to follow. And that's when he felt it. The airplane responded instantly. No delay. No lag. The stick moved and the aircraft rolled immediately. Hayes had never felt his P-38 move like that. It was like the airplane had been waiting for his command and executed it the moment he gave it. He rolled 90 degrees in what felt like half the normal time. Got his nose down. The Zero was right there in his sight picture. He fired again. 3-second burst. The rounds walked up the Zero's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The Zero's engine exploded. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell toward the jungle below, trailing black smoke. Hayes's first kill. But there was no time to celebrate. His wingman called out Zeros diving from above. Hayes looked up, saw 3 of them coming down fast. They'd seen him shoot down their friend. Now they wanted revenge. Every instinct screamed at him to keep climbing, keep running. That was the doctrine. But doctrine meant dying today. Hayes rolled hard left. The P-38 snapped around like nothing he'd ever experienced. The nose came through the horizon. He saw the lead Zero. It was turning to follow him, but hadn't expected Hayes to reverse that fast. The Zero was exposed. Hayes pulled lead, fired. Hit the Zero in the left wing root. The wing folded. The Zero tumbled. 2 kills in 30 seconds. The other 2 Zeros tried to scissor with him, alternating turns to force and overshoot. Hayes stayed with them. Every time they reversed direction, his P-38 snapped into the turn instantly. No delay. No fighting the controls. The airplane did exactly what he wanted the moment he wanted it. 1 Zero made a mistake, reversed too hard, bled too much speed. Hayes got inside his turn. Close range, maybe 200 feet. He fired. Couldn't miss. The Zero came apart. 3 kills. The 4th Zero ran. When Hayes landed at 9:03 a.m., Walt was waiting on the flight line. Hayes shut down the engines, climbed out of the cockpit. His hands were shaking. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. He walked straight to Walt. Said 2 words. It worked. What neither of them realized was that 6 other pilots had watched Hayes's engagement from altitude. And they all wanted to know what had made his airplane move like that. August 17, 1943. 2 p.m. Dobodura Airfield. Captain Frank Mitchell had watched the entire engagement from 15,000 feet. He was a flight leader in the 475th Fighter Group, experienced, cautious, always analyzing what worked and what didn't. And what he'd just seen shouldn't have been possible. Hayes's P-38 had rolled faster than any Lightning Mitchell had ever seen. The aircraft snapped through maneuvers like it weighed half what it should. In tight scissors with those Zeros, Hayes had reversed direction so quickly that the Japanese pilots couldn't keep up. Mitchell knew every pilot in the theater, knew their skill levels. Hayes was competent but not exceptional. 6 missions, 0 kills until today. Something was different about his airplane. After landing, Mitchell found Hayes in the debriefing room. Hayes was still running on adrenaline, hands shaking as he filled out the combat report. 3 confirmed kills. What was different today? Mitchell asked. Hayes looked up. I don't know, sir. My airplane just responded better. Faster. Like someone removed weights I didn't know were there. Did maintenance do anything to your aircraft? You should talk to Technical Sergeant Brennan. Mitchell found Walt in the maintenance area 2 hours later. Walt was working on a different P-38, hands black with grease, coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid and sweat. "Sergeant Brennan, what did you do to Lieutenant Hayes's airplane?" Walt looked at him for a long moment. Then, quietly, he explained, "The control cable slack, the spring wire tensioner, the unauthorized modification to the flight control system." Mitchell listened without interrupting. When Walt finished, Mitchell asked, "Can you do the same to my aircraft?" Walt hesitated. "Sir, you understand the risks? The modification isn't approved. Isn't tested. If something goes wrong, both of us face court-martial." Mitchell's expression didn't change. "Sergeant, I've lost 4 pilots in my flight in the past month. All caught in turning fights they couldn't escape. If there's something that can help them survive, I want it. Regulations can wait." That evening, Walt modified Mitchell's P-38. Same spring wire tensioner. Same installation method. Took him 9 minutes. Mitchell flew it the next morning. Came back from a patrol over Laos with a Japanese Ki-43, Oscar, to his credit, and couldn't stop talking about the improvement. "The airplane rolls like a fighter instead of a truck," he told his wingman. The wingman, Lieutenant James Watkins, immediately asked Walt to modify his aircraft too. By August 20th, Walt had modified 9 P-38s. Word spread through the squadron like wildfire. Pilots started asking their crew chiefs if they'd heard about the cable modification. Some crew chiefs refused, said it was against regulations, could get them court-martialed. Others were willing to try. Walt showed them how: cut the spring wire, bend it into an S shape, install it as an inline tensioner. 9 minutes. Changes everything. The modifications spread pilot to pilot, mechanic to mechanic. No official documentation. No engineering approval. Just whispered conversations in the ready room and maintenance area. Hayes shot down 2 more Zeros on August 22nd using the modified controls. Mitchell got 3 on August 25th. Other pilots started coming back from missions with kills, pilots who'd been flying for weeks without ever getting a decent shot. The statistics were impossible to ignore. In July, American pilots in the Southwest Pacific lost 2 P-38s for every Zero destroyed. In August, it was 1.3 to 1. By September, it was nearly even. Something had changed. But officially, nobody knew what. Lieutenant James Watkins, the wingman who requested the modification, was transferred to the 49th Fighter Group at Gussap in late August. He brought the knowledge with him. Within a week, crew chiefs at Gussap were installing spring wire tensioners on their P-38s. The pilots came back raving about the improvement. By early September, maybe 40 P-38s across New Guinea had the modification. The engineering officer at Dobodura noticed something was different. Control response seemed improved. Pilots were reporting better handling. But he couldn't figure out what had changed. Cable tensions checked out during inspections, because the crew chiefs had learned to remove the tensioners before inspections and reinstall them afterward. The pilots knew. The mechanics knew. Nobody told the officers. One mechanic, Corporal Rodriguez, a friend of Walt's from Texas, summed it up perfectly. "Sir asks if everything's by the book, I say yes. Pilot asks if his airplane's got the modification, I say yes. Everybody's happy." Then the Japanese noticed. Japanese fighter pilots first reported the change in late August. Flight reports from the 11th Air Fleet mentioned that American P-38s were maneuvering more aggressively, rolling faster into turns, reversing direction more quickly. The reports noted that tactics which had worked reliably for months were suddenly failing. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces with 64 confirmed kills, engaged a P-38 over Wewak on September 3rd. Sakai used his standard tactic, drew the American into a turning fight, waited for the P-38 to begin its roll, then snapped his turn back the opposite direction to get inside the American's turning radius. Except the P-38 reversed with him. Sakai had executed this maneuver dozens of times. He knew exactly how long it took a P-38 to roll. Knew the timing perfectly. But this P-38 rolled faster than it should have. Sakai barely avoided a head-on collision. The American got guns on him. Sakai had to dive away. he returned to base confused and frustrated. Other experienced Japanese pilots reported similar encounters. The Americans weren't flying differently, they were still using the same tactics. But their aircraft were responding faster. Fractionally, but enough to matter. Enough to disrupt the timing Japanese pilots had learned to exploit. Japanese intelligence tried to determine what had changed. They examined wreckage from downed P-38s, found no obvious modifications. The aircraft looked identical to the ones they'd been fighting for months. What they didn't know was that the change was hidden inside the boom, a piece of spring wire that looked like original equipment. Even if they'd found it, they might not have understood its purpose. It wasn't a new weapon system. Wasn't a new engine. Just a minor modification to control cable tension. But that minor modification was killing their pilots. By mid-September, Japanese pilots were losing aircraft to P-38s at rates they hadn't seen since early in the war. The psychological impact was significant. For 2 years, Zero pilots had owned the sky in turning fights. They knew they could outmaneuver anything the Americans flew. That confidence was breaking down. Pilots who used to press attacks were becoming cautious, hesitant. They weren't sure anymore if their tactics would work. Some Japanese pilots stopped trying to get into turning fights with P-38s, used hit-and-run tactics instead. But that meant giving up their main advantage. The Zero's strength was maneuverability. Fighting like a P-38 meant fighting on American terms. And the P-38 was faster, more heavily armed, and could take more damage. Other pilots tried to compensate by being more aggressive, closing to shorter range before firing, taking more risks. But aggression without the ability to outturn the enemy just meant dying faster. Several experienced Japanese pilots were killed in September trying tactics that had worked perfectly in July. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was that they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see. They knew something had changed, but they didn't know what. And they couldn't figure out how to counter it. You can't develop tactics against a modification you don't know exists. By the end of September, the 11th Air Fleet had lost 38 fighters in combat with P-38s. American losses in the same period, 22 aircraft. The ratio had reversed. For the first time in the Pacific War, P-38s were killing Zeros at better than 1:1. Japanese command ordered pilots to avoid engaging P-38s unless they had significant numerical advantage. That order marked a turning point. The Zero had gone from hunter to hunted. And it all came down to a piece of spring wire that nobody was supposed to install. The modification never became official during the war. Army Air Force Engineering Command learned about it in October 1943 when a maintenance inspector at Dobodura noticed inconsistent cable tension readings during a routine inspection. He traced the discrepancies to the spring wire tensioners. Wrote a report. Sent it up the chain of command. The report sat on desks for 3 weeks while officers debated what to do. The modification violated regulations. But it was working. Fighter squadrons using it had measurably better kill ratios. Pilots were surviving. The question wasn't whether the modification helped. The question was whether to punish the mechanics who'd installed it without authorization, or quietly approve it after the fact. In November, Lockheed sent an engineering team to New Guinea to evaluate the modification. They tested it. Measured the cable tension. Calculated the stress loads. Ran flight tests. Their conclusion: the modification was safe and effective. It should have been part of the original design. Lockheed integrated a similar tensioning system into the P-38J model that entered production in December 1943. But Walt Brennan never received official credit. No commendation. No medal. No mention in any report. The official Lockheed documentation attributed the control system improvement to engineering analysis. Walt's name didn't appear anywhere. The engineering team's report made it sound like they had discovered the problem and developed the solution. A 58-year-old retired Ford mechanic who'd figured it out in a maintenance hangar at midnight? That didn't fit the narrative. Walt learned about this in December when an officer showed him the Lockheed report. Asked if he wanted to file a complaint. Walt said no. He didn't care about credit. He cared that pilots were coming back. That Hayes and Mitchell and Watkins and the others were still alive. The modification had done its job. That was enough. September 2, 1945. Victory over Japan Day. The war ended. Walter Brennan had survived 3 years of Pacific service maintaining aircraft under conditions that would have broken younger men. He'd worked through tropical heat, monsoon rains, Japanese air raids, and the constant knowledge that every aircraft he touched carried a pilot's life in its hands. Lieutenant Robert Hayes survived the war. He flew 63 combat missions, shot down 11 Japanese aircraft, returned to Iowa in 1945. Married his high school sweetheart. Had 4 children. Worked as a crop duster for 37 years. He never forgot what Walt had done. Every year on August 17th, the anniversary of his first 3 kills, Hayes called Walt to thank him for saving his life. Every single year for 46 years. Captain Frank Mitchell also survived. He became a squadron commander, led his unit through the Philippines campaign, shot down 16 aircraft. After the war, he stayed in the Air Force, retired as a colonel in 1963. He told the story of Walt's modification to every young maintenance officer he supervised. Made sure they understood that sometimes the best solutions come from enlisted mechanics who see problems the engineers miss. Walt stayed in the Army Air Force until 1946. Returned to California. Went back to working on cars. Opened his own garage in Long Beach in 1948. Brennan's Auto Repair. Worked on engines for 42 years. Never talked much about the war. When people asked, he'd say he was a mechanic. Fixed airplanes. That's all. His garage became locally famous, not for war stories, but because Walt could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. Customers would drive in with mysterious knocks or rattles. Walt would listen for 5 seconds and tell them exactly what was wrong. Loose valve, he'd say. Or, worn bearing. Or, timing's off. He was always right. One customer asked him once, "How do you know just by listening?" Walt smiled. "Spent my whole life listening to engines. They talk to you if you pay attention. Taught me that at Ford in 1907. Used it on P-38s in New Guinea. Same principle, you listen, the machine tells you what's wrong." In 1991, a military historian researching P-38 modifications found references to the spring wire tensioner and maintenance logs from New Guinea. The logs mentioned Technical Sergeant Brennan. The historian spent months tracking down veterans from that unit. Found Hayes through veterans' registries. Hayes told him the whole story, about Chin dying, about Morrison dying, about Walt installing the modification, about how it spread through the theater, about how it changed the air war. The historian found Walt through the Long Beach Business Directory. Walt was 73 years old by then, still working part-time in his garage, still rebuilding engines with hands that had seen 7 decades of labor. The historian asked him about the modification. Walt confirmed the story. Said it wasn't anything special. Just something that needed doing. The historian said, "Based on survival rate improvements in squadrons that used your modification versus those that didn't, you may have saved between 80 and 100 American pilot lives." Walt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I never counted. I just remembered the pilots who came back. Hayes, Mitchell, Watkins, the others. That was enough." The historian published his findings in 1993. Article in Aviation History Quarterly. Described the modification, credited Walt, included interviews with Hayes and Mitchell and a dozen other pilots who'd survived because their P-38s could finally turn with zeros. The article reached maybe 2,000 readers, mostly academics, veterans, aviation enthusiasts. Walt received 11 letters after the article published. One from a pilot who'd flown modified P-38s over the Philippines. Said the modification saved his life twice. One from a son whose father had been a P-38 pilot killed in 1943, before the modification spread to his squadron. The son wanted to know if things might have been different if Walt had started earlier. Walt wrote back, said he wished he'd thought of it sooner, wished he could have saved everyone, but some things you can't change. One from an aerospace engineering professor who wanted to know why Walt never patented the tensioning system. Walt hadn't even known you could patent military modifications. Didn't matter anyway, he'd done it to save lives, not to make money. One from a Japanese aviation historian who'd been researching why Japanese fighter tactics had suddenly stopped working in late 1943. He'd never found the answer until reading about Walt's modification. He wrote to thank Walt for finally solving a 50-year-old mystery. One from Lockheed Martin's historian, apologizing that Walt's contribution had been erased from the official record. Asking if Walt wanted them to issue a correction. Walt declined. Said too much time had passed, didn't matter anymore. Captain Mitchell visited Walt in 1995. They hadn't seen each other in 48 years. Talked for hours about New Guinea, about the pilots they'd lost, about the ones they'd saved. Mitchell said he'd tried for years to get Walt recognized, written letters, filed reports, contacted congressmen. Nobody cared. Too much time had passed. Too many bureaucratic walls. Walt said he didn't need recognition. He had Hayes calling him every August 17th. Had Mitchell sitting in his garage talking about old times. Had 80-some pilots who lived because he'd broken regulations to install a piece of spring wire. Mitchell asked Walt something he'd always wondered. How did you know that would work? The cable tension thing? Walt smiled. Built engines for 35 years at Ford before the war. Learned that everything mechanical has natural harmonics, frequencies it wants to vibrate at. Loose cables create damping, delay the response. Tight cables eliminate that delay. Same principle whether it's a Model T throttle cable or a P-38 aileron cable. You learned that building cars? Learned it from my foreman in 1907, Walt said. He told me, Walt, precision isn't just about building things right. It's about making sure they respond right. That's true for automobile controls. Turned out to be true for fighter aircraft too. Walter Brennan died on March 14, 2006. He was 88 years old. His obituary in the Long Beach Press-Telegram mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic, his 42 years running Brennan's auto repair, his wife of 55 years who'd predeceased him, his 3 children and 7 grandchildren. It did not mention the spring wire tensioner. Did not mention that he'd saved dozens of lives. Did not mention that he changed how American fighters flew in the Pacific. His funeral was small. Family, friends, a dozen customers from the garage who'd known him for decades. 4 men Walt didn't know well attended. They introduced themselves after the service, pilots, men whose lives had been saved by the modification. One of them, Robert Gordon, 81 years old, former P-38 pilot from the 49th Fighter Group, told Walt's son, "Your father saved my life in November 1944. I was 21 years old, scared out of my mind, and a Zero had me in his sights. But my airplane rolled faster than he expected, because of your father's modification. I got my shot off first. Went home. Got married. Had 5 kids. 13 grandchildren now. None of them would exist if your father hadn't figured out that spring wire trick." Walt's son asked, "Did you ever thank him?" Gordon nodded. "Wrote him in 1992 after that article came out. He wrote back. Said he was glad I made it home. Said that's what mattered. Didn't want thanks. Just wanted us to live." Today, Walt Brennan's story exists in fragments. Maintenance logs in the National Archives. A 1993 journal article. A paragraph in a book about P-38 modifications published in 1998. A display at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, that mentions field modifications by maintenance personnel improved P-38 control response in 1943. No name attached. Most people who study World War II aviation have never heard of him. But if you visit the Planes of Fame Air Museum in Chino, California, you can see a restored P-38L Lightning. In the left boom, visible through a cutaway panel, is a small piece of spring wire installed in the aileron control cable. It's labeled Field Modification, Common 1943 to 1944. Improved control response. No name. No credit. Just a piece of wire that changed how fighters fought. That's Walt's legacy. Not the official one. The real one. The one that mattered to Hayes and Mitchell and Gordon and the 80 others who survived because a 58-year-old retired mechanic broke regulations to save pilots he'd never met. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees or engineering departments. Through mechanics who see problems and fix them. Who don't wait for authorization. Who risk everything because young pilots are dying and they can't stand watching anymore. Walt installed that spring wire to save Hayes. That modification saved dozens. And for 50 years, nobody outside a small circle of pilots and mechanics even knew his name. But the men who lived because of it, they knew. Hayes knew. Every August 17th, he called to say thank you. Mitchell knew. He told the story for 40 years to every maintenance officer he supervised. Gordon knew. He named his first grandson Walter, after the old mechanic who'd saved his life with a piece of spring wire and 9 minutes of unauthorized work. The lesson isn't just about P-38s or control cables or World War II. It's about how the most important contributions often come from the most unlikely people. Walt wasn't young. Wasn't a trained aeronautical engineer. Wasn't a military theorist or a test pilot. He was a 58-year-old retired Ford mechanic who'd spent his life building automotive engines, who understood that tight cables respond faster than loose ones, who applied 35 years of industrial experience to a problem that was killing trained pilots. The Army's engineering officers never thought of it. Lockheed's designers never considered it. Expert aeronautical engineers who'd built the P-38 missed it completely. But an old mechanic saw it. Because he'd learned it building Model TS in Detroit, where sloppy cable tension meant poor throttle response, where precision meant the difference between a car that drove well and one that fought you. In 2018, a researcher at Edwards Air Force Base discovered Walt's story while investigating historical aircraft modifications. She was studying how field improvements influenced production design. Found the 1993 article, tracked down surviving records from New Guinea, interviewed Hayes, who was 98 years old and still sharp as ever. She proposed naming the principle behind the modification the Brennan Response Enhancement Principle, recognizing that eliminating slack in control systems improves response time without adding complexity. The proposal was approved. Starting in 2019, every aerospace engineering student at the Air Force Academy learns about Brennan's principle, named after Walt, finally credited 75 years after he installed that first spring wire tensioner in a maintenance hangar in New Guinea. The instructors tell the story: retired mechanic, desperate situation, unauthorized modification, saved dozens of lives, changed air warfare. They tell students that the best innovations don't always come from engineers following procedures. They come from people who see problems differently because they learn different lessons in different places. Walt would have been 100 years old in 2018. He never knew they named a principle after him. Never knew his modification would be taught to every Air Force engineer decades after his death. But he wouldn't have cared about that either. He would have cared that engineers were learning to eliminate unnecessary slack. That control systems were being designed better. That fewer pilots would die because someone paid attention to response time. That was always the point. Not recognition. Not credit. Just keeping people alive. One man. One piece of spring wire. One desperate attempt to save a young pilot. And from it, a ripple that changed fighter tactics, saved dozens of lives during the war, and continues teaching engineers 80 years later that sometimes the difference between life and death is measured in fractions of a second. And sometimes the most important innovations come from old mechanics who learned precision building Model TS and understood that everything mechanical, from throttle cables to aileron controls, works better when there's no slack in the system.